The autumn wind carried the scent of sage and dust across the high desert as Jake Johnson stood at his father's grave, his weathered hands gripping the brim of his hat. The simple wooden marker bore the name Samuel Johnson, along with last week's date, October 12, 1885. At 26, Jake hadn't expected to inherit the Running J Ranch so soon, especially not after finding his father face down in Silver City's muddy Main Street with a bullet in his back. The modest gathering of mourners had long since departed, leaving Jake alone with his thoughts and the endless expanse of New Mexico territory stretching out before him. His father had built something remarkable here, a prosperous cattle operation fed by the crystal-clear springs that bubbled up from deep limestone aquifers. Those same springs had recently caught the attention of William Davis and James Wilson, the powerful cattle barons whose vast spreads bordered the Running J on three sides. Sarah Miller, daughter of the local general store owner, approached quietly from behind, her dark hair whipping in the wind. She'd grown up alongside Jake, and lately their childhood friendship had begun blossoming into something more. "Your father was a good man," she said softly, placing a gentle hand on Jake's shoulder. "He didn't deserve what happened to him." Jake nodded silently, thinking of the way his father had taught him every aspect of ranching, from breaking horses to reading weather patterns in the sky. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention. Thomas Thompson, Silver City's young deputy sheriff, reined his horse to a stop nearby. "Jake, got some news you'll want to hear," he called out. "Judge Miller just received a letter from the Territorial Land Office questioning your father's water rights. Claims there might be some irregularities with the original filing." Jake's jaw tightened. He'd been expecting something like this ever since Davis and Wilson had started making offers to buy the Running Jay's springs. Back at the ranch house that evening, Jake pored over his father's papers by lamplight. The deed to the water rights was exactly where Samuel had always kept it, in the old Confederate cavalry strongbox beneath a loose floorboard. But something about the document caught Jake's eye. The territorial seal looked slightly different from other official papers he'd seen, and the ink had an odd sheen to it. His father had mentioned tensions with Davis and Wilson, but he'd never suggested anything was amiss with the ranch's legal standing. Elizabeth Davis, William's daughter, had warned Jake about her father's schemes during a chance encounter in town 3 days ago. Though their families were rivals, she'd seemed genuinely concerned. "The railroad's coming through next year," she'd whispered urgently. "My father and James Wilson have been meeting with men from back east. Something big is happening, Jake. Your father was asking too many questions." Now, studying the possibly forged water rights, her words took on new meaning. Jake's childhood friend Catherine Thompson, the deputy's sister, worked as a clerk in the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe. He penned a careful letter asking her to quietly examine the original filing. If someone had tampered with documents, there would be evidence. But he knew he had to be cautious. His father's murder suggested powerful people were willing to kill to keep their plans hidden. The spring water wasn't just about cattle anymore. With the railroad coming, it would be vital for steam engines. The next morning, Jake rode into Silver City to speak with Judge Miller. The streets were busy with the usual mix of miners, cowboys, and merchants, but he noticed several unfamiliar faces. Well-dressed men who watched him too closely as he tied his horse outside the courthouse. Inside, the judge's office was empty except for his daughter Sarah, who worked as his clerk. "Father's been called to Tombstone for an emergency session of the Territorial Court," she explained. "He left last night without warning." Later that afternoon, Jake met secretly with Deputy Thompson in the back room of the general store. "I've been doing some digging," Thomas said in a low voice. 2 weeks before your father died, a private rail car arrived from Fort Worth. Had some important passengers, James Wilson's brother from the Texas and Pacific Railroad, and a man named William Miller from the Territorial Legislature." Jake started at the name. "Any relation to the judge?" he asked. Thomas nodded grimly. "His brother. And there's more. They spent 3 days meeting at the Davis Ranch. Whatever they're planning, it goes beyond water rights." The pieces were starting to form a pattern, but Jake knew he needed proof before he could act. His father had taught him patience in all things, tracking cattle, training horses, and especially dealing with men's schemes. As he rode back to the Running J that evening, he spotted smoke rising from one of the line cabins near the springs. Approaching cautiously, he discovered fresh hoofprints leading away toward the Davis Ranch. Someone was watching the water. and Jake had a feeling events were about to move faster than anyone had planned. Jake dismounted near the line cabin, his boots crunching softly on the sun-baked earth. The smoke had died down, but the ashes were still warm. Whoever had been here left less than an hour ago. Inside, he found scattered papers near the crude wooden table, mostly burned. But one fragment caught his attention. It bore the letterhead of the Texas and Pacific Railroad, though the rest was illegible. His father had kept detailed records of all ranch business in this cabin, including water rights documentation and cattle counts. Now those records were gone. Through the cabin's grimy window, the setting sun painted the western hills in shades of amber and purple. Jake remembered riding these same hills with his father just months ago, learning the subtle signs of weather changes in the cloud patterns and wind direction. Samuel had been teaching him more than ranching. He'd been preparing Jake for this moment, though neither of them knew it then. The thought settled like lead in his stomach. Thomas's words about the private rail car echoed in Jake's mind as he examined the cabin further. Behind a loose floorboard, he discovered his father's old journal, overlooked by whoever had ransacked the place. The last entry was dated 3 days before his death. Meeting with Sarah tomorrow. She has proof of Wilson's dealings with the railroad. Must act quickly. Jake had never heard of Sarah, but if she had information about James Wilson and his railroad connections, he needed to find her. Back at the Running J main house, Jake found Elizabeth, his father's housekeeper of 20 years, waiting with news. A woman had come by asking for Samuel while Jake was out. She'd seemed nervous, wouldn't give her name, but left a message. Tell his son to check the old mission in Silver City. Elizabeth's eyes showed concern. She wore a silver cross, Jake, just like the one your father kept in his desk. The mention of the silver cross sparked a memory. Jake went to his father's study, unlocked the desk drawer, and found the small cross on a leather cord. He'd always assumed it belonged to his mother, who died when he was young. But turning it over, he noticed tiny numbers scratched into the back. Coordinates. Samuel had been mapping something, and now Jake understood why the railroad men were so interested in more than just water rights. That night, as a storm gathered over the distant mountains, Jake studied his father's maps by lamplight. The coordinates formed a pattern across the territory, each marking a spring or water source, but they also traced a route. One that would be perfect for a rail line connecting Tombstone to Fort Worth, bypassing the existing Texas and Pacific track. His father had found a way to break the railroad's monopoly on shipping routes, and it had cost him his life. Dawn found Jake saddling his horse for the ride to Silver City. The old mission held answers, but he knew Wilson's men would be watching. Elizabeth packed him food for the journey, pressing his father's silver cross into his palm with trembling hands. Samuel trusted Sarah, she whispered. But be careful, Jake. The Davis Ranch sent riders out before sunrise. 4 of them headed south. The morning air carried the scent of rain and sage as Jake rode out, his father's journal secure in his saddlebags. The pieces of the puzzle were taking shape. Territorial politicians, railroad executives, and local ranchers all tangled in a web of power and money. But Sarah was the key. She had proof of their schemes, and Jake was betting his life that she'd left it at the mission, waiting for someone to finish what his father had started. Storm clouds gathered over the Mogollon Mountains as Jake pushed his horse southward. In the distance, dust rose from multiple riders moving fast. The Davis Ranch men were making their own play for the mission. Jake turned east, taking the long way around through Apache Pass. He'd learned from Samuel that sometimes the indirect approach was the safest, especially when dealing with men whose greed made them predictable. The race to Silver City had begun, and with it, the chance to expose a conspiracy that reached from the dusty streets of Tombstone to the elegant offices of Fort Worth. Jake Miller stared at the yellowed maps spread across his father's oak desk, trying to make sense of the water rights documentation that had caused so much bloodshed. 3 weeks had passed since he found Samuel Miller's body by the creek, a bullet in his back. The local sheriff had written it off as a random robbery, but Jake knew better. His father had been methodically tracking the manipulation of water claims across the territory, and that knowledge had cost him his life. The autumn wind rattled the windows of the ranch house outside Silver City as Jake pored over his father's careful notes. Samuel had documented meetings between the Thompson cattle empire and railroad executives, along with records of bribes paid to territorial judges. But the smoking gun remained elusive. Jake's hands trembled as he read his father's final journal entry, dated the day of his murder. Meeting William Davis at Cottonwood Creek. Says he has proof of the whole scheme. Sarah Johnson's knock at the door startled Jake from his research. The schoolteacher's face was drawn with worry as she entered, her shawl pulled tight against the chill. "The Thompson men are in town again," she said quietly. "They're asking questions about your father's papers." Her father had been Samuel's closest friend before James Thompson's men ran him off his land last spring. Now she served as Jake's eyes and ears in Silver City, risking her position to help expose the truth. Jake watched through the study window as Catherine Thompson's elegant carriage rolled past the ranch gates, her driver making no attempt to hide his surveillance. The cattle baron's daughter had been Jake's childhood friend once, before family ambitions poisoned everything. Now she moved in territorial society circles, engaged to Thomas Wilson, the railroad magnate's son. Jake wondered if she knew the true cost of her father's empire building. The pieces were starting to fit together in Jake's mind. The territorial governor had recently approved railroad expansion through Silver City, with the Thompson Ranch controlling key water access points. Any independent ranchers who refused to sell their water rights found themselves facing mysterious accidents or trumped-up legal charges. Samuel Miller had been gathering evidence of the corruption when he died. Mary Davis appeared at Jake's door that evening, her face streaked with tears. "They killed him," she whispered. "They killed my William before he could tell your father what he knew." Jake's heart sank as another piece fell into place. William Davis had been the territory's water rights commissioner before his accidental drowning last month. Now, two men who knew too much were dead, and Jake was treading the same dangerous path. Elizabeth Wilson's telegram arrived the next morning, delivered by a nervous boy from the Silver City office. The railroad president's wife had been Samuel Miller's confidant years ago, before her marriage. Her message was brief but clear. "What you seek is in the old mission records. Trust no one in town." Jake remembered the crumbling Spanish mission where his father often rode, supposedly researching local history. The mission's dusty archives yielded their secrets reluctantly. Jake found land grant documents dating back to Mexican rule, proving the Thompson water claims were based on forged titles. But more damning were the recent letters between James Thompson and Thomas Wilson, detailing their plan to control the territory's water and transportation. They needed one final piece: the Miller Ranch's senior water rights. Emma Thompson found Jake at the mission, her approach unannounced. Unlike her sister Catherine, Emma had rejected their father's ruthless methods. "They're meeting tonight," she said urgently. "Father, Thomas Wilson, and the territorial judge. They're going to file papers seizing your water rights, claiming back taxes. You have until sunrise to stop them." Jake saw the fear in her eyes, knowing she risked everything by warning him. The puzzle pieces crystallized in Jake's mind as he rode back to the ranch. This was bigger than just water rights or railroad routes. Thompson and Wilson were positioning themselves to control the entire territory's economic future. His father had discovered their plan and paid with his life. Now Jake had one night to expose the truth before they legally stole everything Samuel Miller had died protecting. The real question was who in Silver City he could trust to help him bring justice. A rider approached through the gathering dusk. Catherine Thompson, coming alone despite the impropriety. Jake tensed, unsure of her motives after all this time. "I know what my father did," she said softly, dismounting. "I found his letters about your father's murder. I can't live with this anymore." Jake studied her face, wondering if this was another trap or the key to finally exposing the truth about Samuel Miller's death. The ranch house lights burned late into the night as Jake and Catherine pieced together the evidence. Her father's private papers provided the final links, revealing a vast conspiracy reaching into the territorial capital. As dawn approached, they had assembled a case that would bring down the Thompson-Wilson alliance. But they had to survive the night first. James Thompson's men were already riding toward the Miller Ranch, determined to silence the truth once and for all. The first shots cracked through the pre-dawn stillness as Jake and Catherine crouched behind the heavy oak desk in Samuel Miller's study. Bullet holes peppered the walls, sending splinters of aged wood flying. Jake could smell gunpowder mixing with the leather and dust that had defined his father's sanctuary. He knew the ranch house's defensive weaknesses. They needed to move before Thompson's men could surround them completely. "There's a cellar passage," Jake whispered, pulling Catherine toward the kitchen. "My father built it during the Apache raids. It comes out in the north pasture." His voice caught as he remembered helping Samuel dig that tunnel years ago, never imagining it would one day save his own life. They slipped through the hidden trapdoor, just as boots thundered across the porch. The underground passage was cramped and musty, forcing them to crawl through darkness thick enough to choke on. Catherine's breathing came in sharp gasps as they pushed forward, the sounds of destruction echoing from above. Jake's mind raced. They needed to get to Silver City and Marshal William Barnes before Thompson's men could catch them. The evidence in Catherine's saddlebag had to reach the territorial authorities. They emerged into pale morning light beside a lightning-struck cottonwood. Jake helped Catherine up, then froze at the sound of approaching horses. But it was Thomas Wilson's youngest son leading a small group of ranch hands, allies Jake hadn't expected. "Your father sent us," the boy explained quickly. "He's breaking with Thompson. Says it's time to end this before more blood spills." The ride to Silver City was tense, every shadow potentially hiding Thompson's assassins. Catherine rode close to Jake, the saddlebag of documents bouncing against her leg. She spoke of growing up watching her father change, power and greed, twisting him into someone she no longer recognized. The pain in her voice matched Jake's own loss, creating an unexpected bridge between them. Marshal Barnes met them at his office, face grim as he examined the evidence. Railroad contracts, forged water rights, coded telegrams about Samuel Miller's murder. The web of corruption spread far beyond Silver City. "This goes straight to the territorial capital," Barnes said. "I've got a friend there, Judge Elizabeth Montgomery. She's been building a case against these railroad schemes. Your evidence could break it wide open." But as Jake and Catherine prepared to ride for the capital, word arrived that James Thompson had fled toward Fort Worth with a group of hired guns. He'd taken hostages, including Thomas Wilson's wife Sarah and daughter Emma. The conspiracy was unraveling into desperate violence. Jake knew his quest for justice had unleashed forces that threatened to destroy more innocent lives. Catherine gripped Jake's arm as he stared at the telegram. "We can't let my father hurt more people," she said fiercely. "The evidence needs to reach Judge Montgomery, but those hostages—" Jake nodded slowly, understanding the choice before them. The documents could expose the conspiracy, but only if they survived to testify. First, they had to stop James Thompson's final savage bid for escape. They gathered a posse of trusted men, including Thomas Wilson's ranch hands and several of Marshal Barnes's deputies. The group rode hard toward Fort Worth as storm clouds gathered over the distant mountains. Jake felt the weight of his father's gun at his hip, remembering Samuel's words about justice being more than revenge. He glanced at Catherine, seeing the same determination in her eyes. Together, they would end this, not just for their fathers, but for the future of the territory itself. The storm broke just as they reached the outskirts of Fort Worth, rain drumming against leather and washing away their tracks in the muddy earth. Jake led the posse through back alleys, avoiding the main streets where Thompson's men would be watching. Catherine had grown up in these streets, and her knowledge of the city's hidden passages proved invaluable as they made their way toward the abandoned tannery where the hostages were being held. Thunder rolled across the sky as Jake studied the weathered building through his field glasses. Two armed men patrolled the upper walkway, while lamplight flickered behind grimy windows. He counted at least 6 more shadows moving inside. The hostages, Thomas Wilson's wife Elizabeth and their young son, were likely being held in the basement, away from prying eyes. Sarah, the elderly proprietor of the local boarding house, had slipped them vital information about Thompson's operation. The cattle baron's desperation had made him sloppy, hiring local thugs who couldn't keep their mouths shut after a few drinks. But Jake knew Thompson himself would be more careful. The man hadn't built his empire by being careless, even now with everything unraveling around him. Jake Miller stood at the edge of his father's grave, the freshly turned earth still dark against the sun-bleached grass of Silver City's hillside cemetery. His weathered hands gripped the worn leather of his father's Bible, its pages containing hastily scribbled notes about water rights, deals, and railroad contracts that now seemed more like a death warrant than business records. The shadow of Silver Peak loomed behind him, its jagged outline a reminder of the untamed wilderness that had claimed so many lives in this border territory. Samuel Thompson, the cattle baron whose sprawling ranch bordered the Miller property to the north, had arrived at the funeral with an air of manufactured sympathy that made Jake's blood run cold. Beside him stood William Davis, the Territorial Railroad Commissioner, whose recent arrival in Silver City had coincided with a series of suspicious land acquisitions. Their whispered conversations at the graveside service only confirmed Jake's suspicions about their involvement in his father's death. Sarah Wilson, daughter of the local banker James Wilson, watched Jake from across the cemetery with concern etched across her face. She'd grown up alongside him and now worked as a clerk in her father's bank, where she'd recently discovered irregular transactions involving Thompson's cattle operation and Davis's railroad interests. The information she'd shared with Jake had painted a disturbing picture of corruption reaching far beyond Silver City's dusty streets. The investigation had led Jake to uncover a complex web of deceit. His father's water rights weren't just valuable for ranching, they were crucial for the railroad's planned expansion through the territory. Thompson's cattle empire was merely a front for a larger scheme orchestrated by Davis and a shadowy consortium of Eastern investors who aimed to control every drop of water from Silver City to Tombstone. Catherine Johnson, the widow who ran the Silver City Gazette, had been gathering evidence of the conspiracy for months. Her latest article about missing land deeds and mysterious fires at neighboring ranches had earned her office a nighttime visit from Thompson's men. But they hadn't found her most damning evidence. Documents proving that Territorial Judge Thomas Miller, Jake's own uncle, had been accepting bribes to rule in favor of the railroad's land claims. As dusk approached, Jake met secretly with Mary Davis, the commissioner's estranged wife, in the back room of the Silver City Mercantile. She revealed how her husband had orchestrated similar schemes in Abilene and Fort Worth, using cattle barons as pawns, while the railroad quietly secured water rights through a maze of shell companies and forged documents. Her testimony would be crucial, but getting her safely to the territorial capital would prove dangerous. The pieces fell into place when Elizabeth Thompson, the baron's daughter, sought out Jake with trembling hands and tear-stained cheeks. She'd overheard her father and Davis planning to dam the creek that fed both the Miller Ranch and 3 neighboring properties. The resulting drought would force the smaller ranchers to sell, while Thompson's hidden springs would keep his cattle well watered through the summer. Jake knew confronting them directly would be suicide. Thompson's hired guns were watching his every move. Instead, he worked with Sarah to trace the money through the bank's records, while Catherine prepared a special edition of the Gazette that would expose the entire operation. The evidence was irrefutable, but they needed to survive long enough to present it to the territorial governor's investigator, who was due to arrive on the evening train. As thunder rolled across the valley, Jake positioned trusted ranch hands around Silver City's main street. Thompson and Davis had called a meeting at the Saloon, presumably to finalize their plans. But Jake had already telegraphed their confidential documents to newspapers in 3 territories. Now, with Sarah's financial records, Catherine's investigative reports, and Mary Davis's sworn testimony, the trap was set. The real showdown wouldn't be fought with 6 guns, but with the power of truth and justice. The saloon doors burst open as territorial marshals surrounded the building. William Davis attempted to flee through the back door but found himself face-to-face with Jake, who held not a weapon, but his father's Bible containing all the evidence of their crimes. Thompson reached for his gun but froze when he saw his daughter Elizabeth standing beside Jake, clutching documents bearing his own signature that proved his guilt. The arrests sent shockwaves through the territory. Judge Thomas Miller resigned in disgrace, while James Wilson's bank underwent a thorough audit. The railroad's expansion plans were revised to respect existing water rights, and smaller ranchers formed a cooperative to protect their interests. Jake's father's murder was finally solved when one of Thompson's men confessed, breaking open the entire conspiracy. As autumn painted the hills gold, Jake and Sarah stood on the porch of the Miller Ranch house, watching cattle graze in the valley below. The water rights his father had died protecting now served not just their land, but a community determined to build something better than the greed and corruption that had nearly destroyed them. The frontier was changing, but the legacy of justice his father had championed would endure. The winter winds swept across the valley as Jake and Sarah began rebuilding not just the ranch, but the community's trust. Word spread through Silver City about how a young rancher had exposed the corruption that had plagued the territory, drawing both admiration and lingering resentment from those who'd profited from the old system. Jake found himself navigating a delicate balance between justice served and bridges that needed mending. William Thompson's confession had opened a floodgate of revelations. More of his former associates came forward, detailing years of land grabs, water rights manipulation, and strong-arm tactics that had shaped the territory's development. The evidence implicated several prominent families in Fort Worth, leading to a broader federal investigation that threatened to reshape the entire region's power structure. Sarah proved instrumental in helping Jake manage the expanding responsibilities of the ranch while building new alliances. Her experience as a banker's daughter, combined with her natural diplomacy, helped forge partnerships with honest businessmen who saw the value in fair dealing. Together, they established a new framework for water sharing that would protect both large and small ranchers through the dry seasons. The arrival of Catherine Miller, Elizabeth's younger sister, brought unexpected complications. Unlike her sister, who had helped expose their father's crimes, Catherine harbored deep resentment toward Jake for destroying her family's reputation. Her presence in Silver City created tension, especially when she began working with James Wilson's remaining supporters to challenge the new water rights agreements. Jake's nights were haunted by memories of his father Samuel, wondering if he'd done enough to honor his legacy. The ranch ledgers revealed his father had been helping struggling families long before his death, extending credit and sharing water even when it cut into his own profits. This discovery helped Jake understand the true meaning of his inheritance, not just land and water rights, but a responsibility to the community. As spring approached, tensions escalated when Catherine orchestrated a meeting of disgruntled ranchers in Abilene. Jake and Sarah rode out to confront the gathering, knowing that the future of their reforms hung in the balance. The meeting hall was packed with faces both friendly and hostile, each with their own stake in the territory's future. Elizabeth's unexpected arrival at the Abilene meeting shifted the dynamics. Standing before the assembled ranchers, she shared documents revealing how their father's corruption had actually harmed many of the families present, including Catherine's allies. The revelation created a ripple of understanding through the crowd, as personal grievances gave way to recognition of a shared need for change. The solution emerged not from confrontation but collaboration. Jake proposed creating a regional water council, giving voice to all stakeholders while maintaining the protections his father had died defending. Sarah's financial expertise helped structure agreements that would ensure fair distribution and prevent any single entity from gaining too much control. Through late-night discussions and hard-fought compromises, a new order emerged. Catherine, seeing the wisdom in cooperation, eventually joined the council, bringing her father's former allies into the fold. The territory's water resources would be managed not by force or corruption, but through a system of shared responsibility and mutual benefit. As summer approached, Jake and Sarah's wedding plans became a symbol of the territory's transformation. Families who had once been bitter enemies gathered to celebrate, their children playing together in the same streams that had once sparked bloody feuds. The ceremony, held on the ranch where Jake's father had made his last stand, represented more than just a union of two people. It marked the birth of a new way of life on the frontier. The legacy of Samuel's sacrifice had grown into something larger than one man's dream. The water rights he'd protected now served as the foundation for a community where justice and cooperation replaced the law of the gun. Jake and Sarah's ranch became a meeting place for those working to build a better future, proving that even in the wildest territories, the power of right could triumph over might. Jake Johnson stood at the center of the Tombstone courthouse, his weathered hands gripping the wooden railing as he faced down the men who had orchestrated his father's murder. William Thompson, the railroad baron, sat with an arrogant smirk beside Thomas Wilson, the territorial judge whose corruption had nearly cost Jake everything. The gathered crowd whispered and shifted in the packed gallery, the tension thick as summer storm clouds. Sarah Miller, the newspaper editor who had helped Jake uncover the conspiracy, sat in the front row, her notebook open but forgotten in her lap as she watched the proceedings with fierce intensity. Over the past months, she had become more than just an ally in Jake's quest for justice. She had become his anchor in a world that had tried to sweep away everything he held dear. The evidence Jake had gathered lay spread across the prosecutor's table. Forged water rights documents, telegrams proving the conspiracy between Thompson's railroad interests and Wilson's judicial manipulation. And most damning of all, the bullet that matched Thompson's prized Colt revolver to the shot that had killed Samuel Johnson that fateful night. James Davis, the honest marshal who had finally agreed to help Jake after his own brother was threatened by the conspirators, stood guard at the courthouse door, His presence was a reminder that not all lawmen could be bought, that some still believed in the justice that Jake's father had died defending. Catherine Wilson, the judge's wife who had secretly provided Jake with evidence of her husband's corruption, sat rigid and pale beside Elizabeth Thompson, the railroad baron's daughter who had chosen truth over family loyalty. Their testimony had been crucial in exposing how deep the conspiracy reached, how many honest ranchers had been forced from their land. The investigation had revealed a web of deceit stretching from Tombstone to Silver City, with Thompson and Wilson at its center. They had manipulated water rights, strong-armed smaller ranchers, and used the coming railroad to squeeze every drop of profit from the territory. Jake's father had been their first victim, but far from their last. Mary Davis, the marshal's wife and town doctor, had been the one to preserve the evidence from Samuel Johnson's murder that fateful night, knowing someday it would be needed. Her foresight had provided the final piece of evidence that connected Thompson to the killing, though the cost to her family's safety had been steep. The prosecutor rose, his voice steady as he presented the final pieces of evidence. Ledgers showing bribes paid to territorial officials, maps marking the planned railroad route through stolen ranch lands, and witness statements from other families who had suffered at the conspirators' hands. Jake felt the weight of their combined suffering pressing down on his shoulders. Emma Miller, Sarah's younger sister and the telegraph operator who had intercepted damning messages between the conspirators, sat with her hands clenched in her lap. She had risked everything to help expose the truth, knowing that her position would be forfeit once the conspiracy was revealed. The verdict, when it came, rang through the courthouse like a gunshot. Guilty on all counts. Thompson's face turned purple with rage as he was led away in chains while Wilson collapsed in his chair, his authority and reputation destroyed. Jake felt no triumph, only a deep weariness and the first stirrings of peace. Outside the courthouse, as the summer sun painted Tombstone streets in gold, Jake found Sarah waiting. She took his hand without a word, understanding that some victories came with their own kind of sorrow. Together they watched as Thompson and Wilson were led to the jail, their empire of corruption finally crumbling. The Johnson Ranch would remain in Jake's hands, its water rights secure, but the true victory lay in the justice that had been served not just for his father, but for all the families who had suffered. The railroad would still come, but now it would be built on honest agreements and fair compensation, not threats and murder. In the days that followed, Jake and Sarah worked to help rebuild what the conspiracy had nearly destroyed. Other ranchers returned to their lands, the corrupt officials were replaced, and slowly, the territory began to heal. The legacy Samuel Johnson had died protecting would live on through his son's determination to see justice done. The story of the Great Conspiracy became legend in Tombstone, a reminder that one person's stand for truth could topple even the most powerful enemies. Jake Johnson had become more than just a rancher fighting for his inheritance. He had become a symbol of hope for all those who believed that justice could prevail in the wild frontier. As Jake stood on his father's ranch, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and purple, Sarah beside him, he knew that some battles were worth any price. The water still flowed clear and true through the land, and with it flowed the promise of a future built on honesty and justice rather than greed and corruption. In the months that followed, Jake and Sarah's marriage in the small Tombstone church marked more than just their union. It symbolized the rebirth of hope in the territory. The same community that had once viewed Jake with suspicion now gathered to celebrate, their faces reflecting the changes that had swept through their lives like a cleansing desert wind. Even old William, the grizzled shopkeeper who had first warned Jake about the conspiracy, stood proudly among the well-wishers, his weathered face creased with a rare smile. The railroad still came through the territory, but now it served the people rather than controlling them. Jake had worked with honest businessmen from Silver City to establish fair shipping rates for all ranchers, creating a cooperative that ensured no single entity could dominate the region's commerce. The water rights that had sparked the initial conflict became the foundation for a sharing agreement that helped sustain farms and ranches through even the harshest drought seasons. Sarah's medical practice flourished, expanding beyond their ranch to serve neighboring communities. She established a small clinic in Tombstone where she trained other women in basic medical care, including Mary, a young widow who showed particular promise. The legacy of healing and helping others grew alongside the ranch's prosperity, just as Samuel Johnson would have wanted. The territorial governor appointed Jake to a special commission tasked with reforming land management laws. His experiences fighting corruption made him particularly effective at identifying and closing the legal loopholes that had allowed the conspiracy to flourish. Thomas, a former deputy who had helped expose the plot, became the territory's new marshal, ensuring that justice would be administered fairly. Life on the Johnson Ranch evolved with the changing times. Jake implemented innovative irrigation techniques learned from studying the old Spanish missions, making the land even more productive than it had been in his father's time. The original homestead house was expanded, its new wings embracing the future while preserving the core where Samuel had raised his son. Letters arrived from Fort Worth, bringing news that James, one of the conspiracy's key witnesses, had successfully established a new life there after testifying. His courage in coming forward had inspired others to stand against corruption, creating a network of honest citizens determined to prevent similar schemes from taking root elsewhere in the territory. The desert seasons turned, each bringing its own challenges and rewards. Jake and Sarah's first child, named Samuel after his grandfather, learned to walk in the same rooms where Jake had taken his first steps. The boys' laughter echoed through the house, mixing with the sounds of cattle, horses, and the ever-present wind that swept across the high desert plateau. Elizabeth, an elderly rancher's widow who had lost everything to the conspiracy, finally returned to her land. With help from Jake and other neighbors, she rebuilt her small cattle operation, proving that age and hardship were no match for determination and community support. Her success became another symbol of the territory's resurrection. As the years passed, the Johnson Ranch became a gathering place for those seeking advice or assistance in navigating the complex relationships between land, water, and progress. Jake never forgot the lessons learned during his fight for justice. That strength came not just from standing alone, but from building bridges between people who shared a vision of fairness and mutual respect. The water that had once been the source of so much conflict continued to flow through the land, nurturing not just crops and cattle, but the growing bonds between neighbors who had learned to trust one another. The conspiracy that had threatened to destroy everything had instead forged something stronger, a community united by shared values and a determination to protect what mattered most. In quiet moments, Jake would sometimes visit his father's grave, now marked by a simple stone in a small cemetery overlooking the ranch. He would tell Samuel about the grandchild who bore his name, about the changes in the territory, and about the enduring impact of his sacrifice. The wind would whisper through the desert grass, carrying with it the promise that some legacies never truly die, but live on in the hearts and actions of those who remain.